Welcome to BW Woodworks. In this video, I'll show you how I built this patterned plywood tambour TV cabinet. As I break down the Baltic birch plywood for the carcass and outer sections, I want to give a big shout out to Michael Alm for inspiring me to build this piece and document the process. I've been watching his videos for a while and find his work to be beautiful, creative, and incredibly informative. So thanks, Michael. Though this is only my first or second attempt at tambour, I felt confident enough in my skills to tackle this project. Since I was trying a few new techniques, I had to remind myself to be patient and treat mistakes as learning opportunities. I decided to add black walnut accents throughout the piece to contrast with the lighter birch. For this, I used iron-on edge banding, a thin veneer with an adhesive backing that's easily applied with heat. After application, there's always some excess that needs trimming to make it flush with the plywood. I just use a basic box cutter for that. Right now, I'm making the inner carcass, which will hold my electronics and some books. I decided to pre-finish the interior because it's difficult to apply an even layer of finish in the tight corners once assembled. I'm using General Finish's Armor Seal, as I've had success with their products before and wanted to try out this clear finish. So far, I think it looks great. It took about 3 days and 4 layers to build up enough finish before I felt comfortable to assemble. Since the joinery won't be visible, I'm keeping it simple by using screws to assemble the carcass. The two key things to focus on are making sure your drill bit is properly lined up with the plywood and ensuring each piece is flush and at a 90-degree angle. I added a few dividers to support the carcass and store my things. I was nervous about breaking through the plywood with a poor pre-drill, but fortunately, everything worked out as planned. Before we continue, I want to briefly explain what tambour and patterned plywood are. Patterned plywood is made by cutting plywood into strips and using the inner layers or veneers to create a pattern. These patterns are made by gluing these strips together into a panel, then cutting across the grain. There are many patterns, but I'm using a basic chevron or zigzagging design. Tambour is a flexible wooden panel made by attaching cloth or fabric to the back of each piece, without gluing the wood together. This panel then slides into a track. I've usually seen solid hardwood used for this, but was inspired by Michael Alm's use of patterned plywood. To make the patterned plywood, I started by ripping the Baltic birch into strips, each ½ inch wide and about 24 inches long. I need over 110 for this project. This first cut determines the overall thickness of the final tambour piece. After what felt like forever cutting the strips, I began gluing them together, using a paint roller to spread the glue more easily. Once the panel was dry, I flattened it using my planer. The plywood's end grain was tough on the planer knives, so I took light passes, removing small amounts until the piece was 7/16 of an inch thick. I chose this thickness because I'm making the track ½ inch wide. leaving a 1/16 of an inch gap for the tambour to slide, which, though it may not seem like much, is plenty. Before starting this project, I made a test cabinet with a similar design and found my original tambour was way too thick for the track, making it hard to slide. By reducing the thickness, not only did I save on materials, but I made it fit way more comfortably. Now that the panels are ready, we can use the table saw to cut them at a 45-degree angle, creating strips that can be arranged into a zigzag pattern. I need about 120 strips for the tambour, which was a bit tedious again. After cutting, each strip has pointed ends that need to be trimmed. To do that, I set up a few different stops on my crosscut sled. With all the pieces ready for gluing, I set up a form on a sheet of melamine. I cut some pine pieces to match the thickness of the tambour and used them as the form. After screwing down the long side, I lay the pieces on the board to create the chevron pattern, making the form as tight as possible against the tambour. Unfortunately, my camera shut off. It didn't capture the setup of the last two pieces, but I repeated the same steps, cutting two pieces the same length as the tambour and placing them here and here to squeeze the entire panel together. I'll cover each edge with painter's tape to make sure the tambour doesn't stick to the form. This piece needs a lot of glue. The plywood's end grain absorbs a ton, and the cloth does too. I make sure to use a bit extra, just to be safe, covering both the cloth and the plywood. The cloth is applied to the tambour, and I smooth out every wrinkle with my hands and an iron. The heat from the iron also helps the glue set a bit faster. After 5 to 6 hours of drying, I trim the excess cloth with a straight edge and box cutter, completing one of the two panels. Then, I repeat the process for the other panel. I move on to making the track for the pattern plywood. For this, I need to create another form from melamine, cutting it to be an inch shorter than the top and bottom, while rounding the corners. Once the form is ready, I attach it to the plywood with screws to keep it in place. The screw holes won't be an issue, since the carcass will cover them eventually. Using a router and the form as a guide, I route the track into the plywood. This cut was a bit dangerous because I had to cut the track to its full depth in one pass, so I focused on having a steady hand and gripping the router tightly. With the track completed, I rounded over the corners with a jigsaw and orbital sander for clean edges. After that, it's back to some more edge banding. At this point, almost all the pieces were ready for final assembly, and I wanted to test the tambour on the tract. It worked even better than expected, even before adding wax, which boosted my confidence that this project would turn out well. The last piece to tackle was the legs. When I started the project, I had no idea what kind of leg base I wanted to build, hoping that ideas would come as I progressed. Unfortunately, I struggled to decide, and at this stage, I needed to choose something. I wanted to use this opportunity to add another walnut accent, but I didn't have enough material in my shop without buying more. Eventually, online, I found a super simple two-leg design that felt perfect. It was straightforward, material saving, and added a nice accent without overshadowing the tambour doors. This process was simple. Using 3 pieces of walnut that have been in my shop for over a year, I quickly created flat surfaces to join them together with the joiner, and then glued them. Once dry, I returned to the joiner to create another flat edge, and I was thrilled with the result. It almost looks like one piece. After flattening the other side, I cut it into 2 equal legs and rounded the edges. Every piece has now been cut to its final size and sanded, so I can add the finish to the last components. Once everything is dry, I'll first attach the legs to the baseboard using 3-inch screws for maximum stability. After that, it's time to attach the carcass, again using screws. Typically, furniture of this nature employs more permanent and often nicer forms of joinery. However, I wanted this piece to be easily disassembled in case there's ever any problem with the track or tambour doors. Ultimately, I believe this to be the most practical way of assembly. I forgot to film myself making the handles, since I'm still getting used to documenting everything I do in the shop, but they are quite simple and complement the rounded look of the piece. I add a layer of wax to both tracks to help the tambour slide more smoothly. I believe this is one of the most important steps when making a tambour door. I ensure not to apply too much wax, just enough to keep the door sliding comfortably. Then, I place the tambour panels on the bottom track and set the top in place. Once the top track is aligned with the tambour, I screw the carcass to the top, fully securing the doors and completing the piece.